So hello everybody, welcome again to the book reading project. It is about the book What is Zen? Plain Talk for a Beginner's Mind. It is an interview between Norman Fischer and Susan Moon, and perhaps you have already enjoyed one of the chapters that were read here and to be found on a playlist. We have 2 chapters left, and today it's about the chapter Zen and Art, which is quite close to my heart. Maybe arts have brought me to Zen, I would rather say, because I'm kind of an art fan, but in a way, I think in a broad way, in a way as Rudolf Steiner and what was the name of the other very inspired artist? Don't know his name. His birthday is this year. Who said everybody is an artist, and I want to see it like that as well. If all of us were brought up in a way we should be brought up, I think, so that our natural creativity, our natural curiosity, our personal way of encountering the others and the world, if we could have lived this in a freer way, then I think more people would have found their personal pleasure, and if it would not be so hard for some people and most people on the earth to earn their money, their bread, for themselves and or for their children, it would be another thing. I'm sure it would be. It would not be that in a measurable way, but I've seen it also in my groups with all necessary humility. But when people are taken serious, and when people are listened to and get put into atmospheres without fear and without concurrence and all this competition and all this stuff we are so used to, but which are finally destructive, then they start to really grow and blossom. I've always seen it. So Zen and Art today. Zen and Art. It's not a long chapter, so I will not divide it in 2 and read it all, as it is a Zen weekend for me. Session will start at 4. I'm really happy to continue and to end this project soon. So Susan Moon Sensei is putting her first question. Why does Zen have such a close connection to various art forms, like haiku and flower arranging, for example? Norman Fischer, Roshi, is answering. As Zen developed in China, it co-evolved with Taoism and the Chinese arts, most notably calligraphy, painting, and poetry. Zen stories like the one about Yun Yan and Tao Wu are a particularly literary form that comes out of this mixture. Traditional commentaries to Zen stories always refer to Chinese poetry, and eminent Zen priests always wrote poetry and did calligraphy. Many of them were painters as well. Some experts claim that in the West's art depicts the external, while in Asia art evokes the inner sense of things, their spirit or soul. In the West, art was for centuries the handmaiden of religion. Artists made pictures, statues, and architecture for the churches, and poets wrote liturgical poems, their themes dictated by religious teachings. In Asia, the arts were an independent source for the spirit, and as such had much to contribute to the development of religion. In China, especially, which was receiving Buddhism from a foreign culture, the effort to make Buddhism Chinese naturally involved some connection to the already existing arts, highly developed by the time Buddhism came. So from the start, art and Zen were close, mutually influencing siblings. I'm not sure about Korea and Vietnam, but certainly in Japan the relationship between Zen and the arts was even richer than it had been in China. Japanese culture in general seems for some reason to have a powerfully aesthetic bent. So under the influence of the Zen teachings and practice, Japan developed many art forms that either didn't exist in China or existed in a far less developed form. Tea ceremony is an example. It began in China as a simple ceremony to serve tea to monks in meditation retreats. But the Japanese took it to another level, developing it into a high art of rich complexity involving architecture, landscape, design, pottery, painting, intense aesthetic attention to movement that is in effect a form of dance, and yes, tea. The same is true of the other arts like ikebana, no drama, poetry, painting, and calligraphy. It is impossible to imagine these Japanese arts without Zen. All of them are based on a set of spiritual principles that come from Zen. Zen has so pervaded Japanese culture that for a Japanese person, being Japanese is being Zen, regardless of whether your religion is Christianity, Buddhism, or no religion at all. The question of Zen and the arts becomes more complicated in the West. In the Western world, art broke free of religion centuries ago and began its independent evolution, eventually becoming intertwined with the most forward-looking aspects of European and American cultures. In the meantime, religious institutions began to feel existentially threatened by the changes that were taking place in the material world in the modern period, by the increasing secularization of culture and their struggle to maintain their traditional values. Since Western religion is understood to be mostly about belief and dogma, it has tried to hold the line on this against the tide of sweeping changes in the contemporary world. Thus, art and religion have become increasingly polarized, and most artists I know are almost allergic to the idea of religion, and most artists I know are, which they see as being opposed to the sort of radical freedom of thought and feeling they think art requires. But art and religion shouldn't be opposites. The Asian idea seems right to me. Art and religion come from the same source, the same imaginative impulse, to express the spirit, the inner life, some sense of living beyond the expected, the conventional, the materialistic, the mundane, even perhaps beyond the knowable. And a lot of Western art has a social intent that I believe also has a relationship to religion, expressing as it does a passion for social justice and universal respect, opposing social forces that would favor the powerful over the common good. So it seems a shame to me that our cultural history has shaped up to make religion and art entirely separate and even antagonistic pursuits. But with Zen it's a different story. Since Zen, as we've been saying, doesn't propose doctrines and beliefs, but instead offers practices and teachings whose purpose is to open up the mind and heart, it's perfectly compatible with the arts. From the beginning, the Zen movement in the West had a strong relationship to the arts. Zen was the first form of Buddhism to be widely popular here. One of Zen's most important transmitters, the Japanese Zen scholar D.T. Suzuki, said, "The arts of Zen are not intended for utilitarian purposes or for purely aesthetic enjoyment, but are meant to train the mind, indeed, to bring it into contact with ultimate reality." This was quoted by John Dido Lowry in his introduction to Enzo, Zen Circles of Enlightenment, by Audrey Yoshiko Seo. Suzuki's wide travel and teaching schedule throughout the United States and Europe was enormously influential, with many American avant-garde artists, including the composer John Cage, the dancer and choreographer Merce Cunningham, and the painter Robert Rauschenberg. Via a separate route, Zen influenced Western art through the beat writers like Gary Snyder, Philip Whalen, Jack Kerouac, and Allen Ginsberg. They and their siblings and followers were critiquing American 1950s culture while committing themselves seriously to the practice of Buddhism, largely Zen. Their influence not only in poetry but in culture in general during the 1960s can scarcely be measured. Personally, I find it hard to imagine how dedication to the arts can be sustained without some support from religious practice. Such support provides inspiration, community, and solace in what could otherwise be a lonely and difficult life path in our excessively commercialized world, unless, of course, one becomes famous and commercially viable, which has its own challenges. There are many artists in our culture who practice Zen or other forms of Buddhism, probably more than we know. I feel that I would add at this point the mystics, the women mystics, that have always bound together writing and prayer and contemplative life, and as I see also male mystics did that. So there was not a division, but we in the West and Germany we have also another definition of poetry. So Susan Moon goes on, "If I studied the tea ceremony or ikebana, would that be basically the same as practicing Zazen? For years, Green Gulch Farm Zen Center has had a tea ceremony program on the theory that studying tea ceremony enhances one's appreciation of Zen practice. When I lived there, I studied tea. It helped me feel how Zen practice is a body practice. We are so cerebral, even when we decide to pay attention to our bodies. We do it intellectually, studying the body as if it were a machine, figuring out how to keep it running well, measuring inputs and outputs, trying to coax higher performance levels. But the body isn't a machine run by the mind. The body and the mind is one phenomenon, body-mind. And understanding this as an idea means nothing. The body-mind has to know it. Doing Zazen enacts this in us, but tea ceremony and other arts like calligraphy that you do with your whole body, feeling, for example, the sense of the brush, also help. I wouldn't say it's necessary for people to practice these things, and I'm aware that these are Asian forms, not ours, but they are useful and satisfying practices. Years ago at Green Gulch, we were host to a group who followed a Japanese tradition called Dento Gejutsu, which means traditional arts, that practice Zen arts as a spiritual path. They would come for about a week, during which they'd practice. No chanting, calligraphy, tea ceremony, ikebana and other Zen arts, which they would do in the spirit of a religious retreat, in the belief that if you suggest these arts are inherently spiritual practices and devotion to them would lead to wisdom and tranquility. I can't say whether doing this kind of program or any other kind of arts program would be basically the same as practicing Zen. But on the theory that nothing is the same as anything, while everything is similar to everything, I would have to say it's not the same, but it's similar. You are talking specifically about the Japanese Zen arts, but it occurs to me we have created our own Western version of Zen arts, that is, arts that are practiced not to produce products or achieve professional proficiency, but to express and develop self-understanding. There are many versions of this, and many, if not most, artists these days make their living in whole or in part by teaching workshops, not for professionals but for the edification of anyone and everyone. This phenomenon is so widespread, it's hard to say how much of it is directly influenced by Buddhism, but I'm sure a great deal of it is. More and more it is becoming commonplace in our culture to see practice of the arts not as an esoteric, demanding and tragic profession, but rather as something we can all engage in for our own growth and enjoyment. I find this development interesting because it is bringing Western arts into accord with the traditional Asian view of art as an expression of spirit. And as such, art can be a part of, and yes, maybe even a substitute for, a spiritual path. Totally agree. And experience this, and many I know have experienced this as well. Former ones, our ancestors, and we as well. Now Susan Moon is answering. You are a poet as well as a Zen teacher. Is there a connection for you between the practice of poetry and the practice of Zen? And Norman is answering. Of course there is, though it took me a long time to appreciate this. It took me a few decades to realize that despite the fact that I seldom mention anything of Zen directly in my poetry, it's going to come out. And since my life is pervaded by my Zen practice, my poetry will of course be a Zen poetry. I guess that I am and have always been writing a poetry about the most unspeakable aspects of the spiritual life. Unspeakable in the literal sense of not being available to language or speech. So my poetry is an attempt to explore what language can't explain. Naturally, I'm failing at this. In my practice of poetry, I'm always trying to discover what the poem I'm trying to write is. I'm not controlling it. I'm listening to it, trying to find out what it is telling me and to follow its lead. So for me, every poem is a new attempt to figure out what writing is. John Cage solved the problem of ego by using chance operations. His whole effort was to get himself out of the way of his work. But I feel as if my sense of self has been so deranged by all my years of Zen practice that I don't need to do what Cage did. Don't need to strictly protect my work from myself by adhering to structure and discipline dictated by chance operations. Besides, I'm probably too lazy for that. So I let the self bleed into the poems along with everything else, whatever else happens to be at hand or whatever else happens while I'm writing. And for me there is also the inescapable fact of my being a Zen priest and all the ways that has changed my sense of life and art, so that's inevitably part of my work, however much I don't intend it to be. I now see this is probably a good thing and lends my poetry its greatest value. So this bow goes to my teacher, Norm Fischer, and goes to our inspirator here for this project, and the other inspirator is Susan Moon. And I love the book they have written together. I think it is of greatest value in terms of trying to figure out together what is Zen and what it could be for us and for maybe everybody in a way. The Saturdays are often not possible for me, the Saturday afternoons, and so I do not know now when the last chapter will be read. I try to announce it before, timely. Perhaps I have an idea how we could kind of celebrate the reading of the end of that book. Thank you for listening. I see one person here. Thank you for being here.